Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello, I'm Shruti Kapela. I teach modern Indian history and political thought at the University of Cambridge. I also write a fortnightly column for ThePrint, and this week I have written on Lakhimpur Kheri and how to interpret what has happened there, which has really captured all the political headlines in India. So Lakhimpur Kheri, I argue, is the tipping point for Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government, because from now on, I argue, whether until certainly the UP elections and perhaps even beyond, this will mark a watershed moment, because up until now, Modi's capture of power, control, particularly over the political narrative, and his ability to dismiss and ignore critics and opponents has held total sway. I think Lakhimpur Kheri, I argue, has changed that. Primarily, this is because it offers a picture of power and protest. It is a very compelling image, an image which is also unfolds during what happened in these events, which is circulating on social media and the like. But what the consequences of those imagery is that, first and foremost, the 1 year long farmers' protest has finally acquired a political significance. I mean, the callous mowing down of protesting farmers by an SUV owned by a union cabinet minister's son has captured in a way the heart of the nature of power and authority in India. So, of course, people had argued that these reforms bills, which were for farmers, were actually reformist in nature. And there were other arguments that against the farmers' protest, that this only represented a small elite, or worse, that even these farmers were merely sectional because they represented Sikh peasantry above all. Now, I would argue that somehow this image has taken all those arguments away. This has overwhelmed any sense of those arguments that have been circulating. Secondly, I think Lakhimpur represents a violent confrontation between protest and state power. So a popular political protest versus state power. It shows the kind of confrontation at it. So despite the pandemic, farmers have been engaged in a year-long civil disobedience with, of course, the single border in Delhi forming the epicenter. They had been camping there for now over a year. Protests, of course, have been a recurring theme of Prime Minister Modi's second term. Recall the CAA protests that happened in the previous winter and had preceded, in fact, the farmers' protests. But until now, the government had either managed or dismissed such protests as expressions of a voluble and disgruntled minority. But this attitude perhaps may have made the government look authoritarian or even arrogant. But ultimately, what it did was that it exuded that Modi had control, and a kind of control that could even incite fear. This carefully cultivated projection of the government's power, to me, seems now upturned, because the widely circulating videos and imagery of farmers being mowed down by a moving automobile owned by a minister's son will be hard to dismiss and ignore, mainly because this visual imagery sharply conveys the callous nature of authority. The imagery of killing in Lakhimpur is also unlike the imagery we saw a few months earlier during, as it was, the second horrible, deathly second COVID wave, when you saw floating dead bodies in the Ganga and various other rivers in Uttar Pradesh. But this is different because at that point, the killer was the virus. By contrast, the protesting farmers will now, the protesting farmers now stand in as a political victim who are marked by abject vulnerability. They appear, because you've literally lost your life protesting, they've marked kind of the figure of an abject vulnerability. So any positive aspect of the farm bills or the charge that the farmers' protests were sectional is now overwhelmed by a visual vocabulary in which a protester looks vulnerable. I find this theme fascinating, partly because I'm a historian, but also because this is precisely the way in which Mahatma Gandhi had fashioned his politics. So I look at violence and the question of vulnerability and what it might have to do with a national narrative. For all its immediacy, the Lakhimpur confrontation, in fact, reminds me and is redolent of India's foundational political grammar. No, I don't mean caste or the Brahmin, who has now been resurrected in Uttar Pradesh's politics. Current political commentary is supercharged on this matrix, as data crunchers now tirelessly remind us of minute and polarized caste calculations at the district level and the likely impact they're likely to have on the coming elections in Uttar Pradesh. After all, Uttar Pradesh is politically the most consequential state in India. But if you for a moment can resist these reductive and self-fulfilling calculations and this data numbering crunches, which caste is voting which way, then I think another quite compelling picture emerges. India's foundational political grammar of mass democracy was based on the idea of mass protest and has historically belonged to the peasantry or the farmers. So just 100 years ago today, under 100 years ago, Mahatma Gandhi had called off a large-scale peasant protest in the United Provinces or Uttar Pradesh in the winter of 1922. At that point, the farmers were protesting against oppressive taxation at the end of the First World War. However, while they were protesting, the farming protesters also killed a few policemen, though they were Indian, but they represented the colonial state. Mahatma Gandhi, of course, called off that movement. Now, often recalled for Gandhi's steadfast commitment to nonviolence, the moment was potent precisely. The most important element of it is because it staged and visibly anointed and announced that the farmer was going to be the prime political agent of India's struggle against empire. Gandhi had actually broken with, at that point, the prevailing political consensus by rejecting the urban elite and by focusing on India's farmers and peasants as the true representatives of India. This focus also actually changed the fortunes of the Indian National Congress, which was up until then a fairly relatively small faction-ridden party dominated by argumentative lawyers, and he converted into a mass movement that also included that very well-heeled and very successful and very wealthy lawyers such as, say, Motilal Nehru, but also even Sardar Patel gave all that up and became satyagrahis. So oppressive agrarian taxation had instigated mass rural protests. This is a kind of tipping point for Indian history. And even at that point, it was argued that it was upwardly mobile peasants who were agitating. The landless were not, the cultivators were not. And therefore, these protests could be rendered sectional. Gandhi's point was not so much about the sociological element, which kind of hierarchy they belong in it. But rather, Gandhi used this moment to empower the question of nonviolence and the question of vulnerability as a form of politics. So in a way, he allowed vulnerability to become a moral power that hollowed out the imperial state's legitimacy despite its control, authority, and command. It was a historic tipping point because it created also for the first time a coalition, a broad coalition against the most powerful modern empire in world history. And from then on, there was no turning back in India's mass politics. So the point I'm making is not that today there is no Gandhi or we should be looking for one, or that the Congress today is but a shell in comparison to its former identity, or that this is not the age of the British Empire. Of course, that's all obvious stuff. Instead, what I'm arguing is that the main danger with this current moment is to make Lakhimpur a contest of violence. Recall that the leader of the farmers, Rakesh Tiket, has said that this is the violence committed by farmers in reaction is a reaction to the callous action of power. I think this is profoundly wrong. This is actually fundamentally wrong, and this form of argument should be rejected. Because the victim is who is powerful. According to Gandhi, the victim can only become a potent agent if it dies but does not kill. This is a central message of Gandhi's satyagrahi nonviolence. And in so doing, when one victim behaves in this manner or converts himself into a moral agent without killing, he also or she converts all other forms of vulnerability. And in a way, it speaks for everyone who is not powerful, who is vulnerable. So in that sense, Chauri Chaura also therefore represented a very broad set of issues, not simply the protesting farmers of Uttar Pradesh. Similarly, this moment has that potential because vulnerability can also transform India's future. Tiket and his followers and the Sanyukta Kisan Morcha, for their own sake, must discard violence and embrace vulnerability. Because it is vulnerability alone, as the image from Lakhimpur powerfully shows, that can potentially sway India's national narrative from its current obsession with control and authority.